Hi folks, this is Donald. Now if you're anything like me, when it comes to watercolour sketching, you will have your watercolour palette in front of you and you'll be staring at the blank sketchbook page wondering, okay, so what do I do now? Watercolour to me is a mysterious beast that I can never really seem to get to grips with, but I think part of the reason is that I haven't practiced enough. I'm keen to get more colour into my sketches and I think watercolour is the way I want to go, but I really do need to practice more. When I was looking for scenes to sketch, I came across this bright and colourful lane in France. Loads and loads of colours. I thought this is going to be a great one to do a painting of, and I'm doing this sketch in real time, so if you want to have a go, you can follow along with me and hopefully you'll do a much better job than I do. I start by wetting the page all over, get it nice and soggy, lots of clean water, and that is because I'm going to use the wet and wet technique and absolutely no planning whatsoever. I'm going straight in with the paint. I found this method the most enjoyable out of the watercolour attempts that I've made so far. The ones that I've done wet and wet, when I've put the paint onto the wet page and then you watch it bleed and go all over the place. So I thought I would try this, and you don't need to be terribly precise. So it's a good straightforward one. If you're fairly new or completely new to watercolour, this is a good one to play with and just see how you get on. I'm using Van Gogh watercolours. This is the same set I always use, and I started with the turquoise green, and as you can see, I'm basically just filling out shapes roughly of what I can see in the scene, and you can be very loose with this because the water that's already on the page is going to pool and bleed the colours all over the place, so all you end up with is rough shapes once it's all dry that you can then draw over the top with. And what I love about when you do the wet and wet technique is that all the colours bleed and can join into each other, and you get all these weird fascinating effects, and every single time you do it you get a different result. This is about as far removed from my comfort zone as it gets in terms of sketching. When I do my typical types of sketches, I'm quite precise about making sure I stay within the lines, using marker pens, and everything's neat and tidy, just like you're doing a colouring in book when you're a kid. I think I've said this before, but when I was a kid doing colouring in books, I remember getting really annoyed if I didn't keep the colours within the lines. That's obviously something that stayed with me. So this method just forces me to do the complete opposite. With no lines to fill in, I can just go wild and just let the colours do whatever they want to do. I then moved to a phthalo blue or phthalo blue, depending on how you pronounce it, and again just splashing it on, lots of water, very very wet. This is going to look a complete mess, but stick with me, it does get better. This is why I love this wet and wet technique, is because literally anyone can do this, and every single time you do it you're going to get a different result. You just have to let the paper and the paint take control and just go with it. If I can do this, literally anyone can do this. So next up I put a lemon yellow in for the building in the background, and again just the rough shape of where the building would be. The reason you don't need to be remotely precise about this is that you'll see later on, once it's completely dry and you start drawing over the top, there will be areas like the sign, for example, where I will be drawing part of the sign will be where the turquoise is, but it will also partially go into the yellow. So all the shapes just kind of tell you where things are, but it doesn't need to be exactly in the right place. So once the first layer of paint is on, I am then trying to get in extra colours, extra pigment to strengthen the colours as much as possible. And the paint was drying pretty quickly because it was a roasting hot day doing this, unusually for Scotland. And with it drying quickly, even in the wet and wet, you can see how the second layer of the stairs, for example, when I put in more quinacridone, you can see how the steps are starting to become defined because the paint underneath is drying. And then I'm putting another layer and it doesn't quite blend in fully. And so I'm just going back in each shape, strengthening the colours. And of the few things I know about watercolour, I do know that once the paint is dry, it goes much duller than it looks when it's wet, which is always an enormous disappointment to me. I love the look of watercolour paint when it's wet, and then once it's all dry, you see what it's turned into, and it's dull and it looks flat and fairly boring. But I think also part of that is because I'm using fairly cheap watercolour paper. And so one of the things I'm going to do next is that I'm going to buy some better quality cotton paper and have a go at that, because from what I gather, on the right type of paper, you'll get a much more vibrant finish. So I think that will be my next step. And I know how easy it is to get carried away buying lots and lots of art equipment. For me, it's pens. I'm always buying pens or researching pens, but I know for others it's paintbrushes. It's funny how the obsession can almost be more about the art supplies rather than the art itself. I think a lot of us are guilty of that. It's the fun of getting a new haul of art supplies arriving in the post is as much an enjoyable experience as doing the art itself. Or maybe that's just me, I don't know, maybe I'm weird. And one of the ironies about doing this channel, it has given me considerably less time to actually practice my sketching techniques and keep trying to improve and get better, because so much of my week now is taken up making these videos, editing them. I spend hours and hours making these videos. Whether it shows, I don't know, but the point is these are all hours that I could have been sketching instead. So I think what I'm going to do is next week I'm going to take a little break, a week off from making videos. If you're watching this at the time it's going out, of course. I just want to have a whole week practicing with watercolour and see if I can see a pattern developing of where I might take my sketching and see if I can get better even over the course of a week. I found when I started sketching, I was sketching the same scene over and over again, and I really saw quite a rapid development in my ability to draw scenes. I want to do the same thing again, but in watercolour. So this is kind of the first one, a tester, just to see where I might go. I'm not totally sure if wet and wet is the right technique for me. I just at the moment feels too different to what I do in terms of my pen and ink drawings. It doesn't even look like it's by the same person. So I want to see if I can find a way to use it in a way that still looks like my sketches at the end of it. And I don't know where it'll go, but it's fun to explore, and that's part of why I enjoy sketching, is all the practice and the seeing the little improvements as you go along. And if you are new to sketching, or maybe you're just been doing it for ages but you don't feel like you're making an awful lot of progress, my philosophy about all of this sketching nonsense is just to try and enjoy what I'm doing, keep trying to learn and accept that I'm not going to be good at certain things, but if I keep practicing then hopefully I will get better at them. As I keep splashing on more and more paint, never knowing when to stop. This is part of the thing that I've got to learn about watercolours. Show some restraint, man. And at this stage it really doesn't look right. It doesn't look like it's going to work. It doesn't look like it's going to make any sense as a picture, but I think with this technique, particularly when you don't even have a pencil guide to go with, you just have to be instinctive and go with it and see what happens. The worst thing that happens is that you ruin a piece of paper, but that's alright. That's what this experimenting is all about. That's why I'm doing this. I'm curious to explore, and I think that's part of what makes sketching and what makes watercolour so fascinating and fun, is because you've really got no idea what could happen. There's so many different ways to try things, and it's great fun just to explore and see what happens. And I know some people watch this and go, this person hasn't got the faintest idea of what they're doing, this is absolutely terrible. But that's sort of missing the point. The whole reason I'm showing this on the internet rather than just doing it in private is because I want to show beginners that it's okay to not be very good at every part of art. You know, that it's a really difficult thing to learn, and I'm a long way from having figured everything out. And I think a big frustration that beginners or people that have been doing it for a while and don't feel like they're making any progress is that the thing that they have a hard time with is comparing themselves to other people. And I think all of us artists have a competitive nature and we always feel like we need to be as good or better than someone else. But if we can just do it for ourselves, it's so much more fun. And we can't all be super gifted watercolour artists, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't take part. I did eventually decide that enough is enough. I'm going to leave the paint to dry, and this is what it looked like when it was dry. So as I was saying, it's significantly dulled the colours compared to when it was wet. I'm now going to draw the scene over the top, and because there's no pencil guide or anything to follow, I am using the paint marks to decide where I should be putting the shapes. Now I'm not too bothered about them fitting in the exact space, so if I draw the sign bigger than the area that is turquoise, for example, that's not something I worry about. In fact, I quite like when you get some of the yellow bleeding into the area where the sign should be. I just really like the effect of that. And I think this does help with your drawing technique as well, because if you're used to being a really serious, detailed pre-planner, then you can't do that with this technique. There's no pencil lines to follow. All you have is these mad splodges of paint. So it really does just force you to crack on with the ink lines and see what happens. So once I'd drawn the outline of the sign, I then added in the chains that the sign is hanging from. And chains are quite a difficult thing to draw, I find, because you have to draw the hoops in a way that the lines don't crisscross over each other. This is only an A5 sketchbook, so at this size they don't have to be especially detailed. A few circles is pretty much sufficient. Now I'm using my LAMY Safari fountain pen to draw with, and I have the extra fine nib placed on that. What I was finding though is that the ink line was bleeding out thicker than if I was drawing on a page that didn't have the paint on it, and I don't know exactly why that is. The page was definitely dry when I started drawing on it, so I don't know if maybe painting first and then drawing over the top of it opens up the pores of the page or something. If anyone would tell me why the ink is thicker when you draw on a page that's had watercolour painted on it than the line would be if it doesn't have watercolour on it, I would love to know, because that seems a bit strange to me. The page is definitely as dry as it would have been if there was no paint on it, but the line, I would say this is more like a medium. And it's not this pen that's causing the issue, because I have noticed this sort of thing with other pens in the past when I've tried this technique, and on different pads as well. So I don't think it's the paper either. And that does make me wonder whether doing this wet and wet technique and then drawing over the top is the right one for me, because I do want to have a thinner line than I could get here. So it might be the case that I instead go with the method of drawing first and then painting over the top of that. And that's a method I find more difficult, because I tend to try to be precise with it like I do with marker pens, and then you end up with a scene that really doesn't look very good because I just don't have a very steady hand when it comes to painting, and it ends up looking a bit messy. I suppose I would have to try and do this same sort of thing but with the drawing underneath. So that's something I want to try, and that's the whole point of experimenting and trying things out, is you can do these things without the expectation that you're going to get it right. I'm just doing this sketch and the other ones I will be following up with, just to try and get to grips with handling the paint and seeing how different methods can inform what I want to do next. I'm sure I can get to grips with it because lots and lots of people do get to grips with watercolour and they can become absolute masters at it. I'm not expecting to become a master by any stretch of the imagination, but I hope that if I can show some development from where I am now to maybe where I am in a while to come, then hopefully other people who are struggling might see this and then see where it ends up. And if I don't get anywhere, well, then that's fine too. At least I'll have tried and I'll know for sure whether watercolour is for me or not. If this watercolour experiment turns into a complete disaster and I get nowhere, then I'll just go back to my colouring and accept my limitations as a sketcher. And really the reason I am sharing these videos with you, regardless of whether they're any good or not, is that for me, when I look for videos, I'm more interested in hearing from the people who don't have all the answers and are finding it a struggle to get the answers that they need and to figure all these things out. I find that more interesting than watching a world-class expert who's been doing this their entire life and can produce these amazing sketches and pieces of artwork that never in a million years would I be able to produce. For me, I want to see the people who are still figuring it out, and I want to see how they're progressing, because that will give me a bit more inspiration and confidence. The problem is I don't think there are that many people doing that, because it's a hard thing to put yourself out there and show you not being very good at something. But I really just feel like if that's what I'm looking for and I can't find it, then there must be other people who are looking for that. Then I think, why not share it? And maybe someone will see it and relate to it and find some encouragement and inspiration that they're not alone. Because it does feel like when you do art on your own, it's a difficult thing. You feel like you're the only person who has ever gone through these struggles. You're the only one who has no idea how to put paint on a page, or draw a scene in perspective, or what colours go together, or what type of materials should I be using. There's so many techniques and other stuff that you need to learn, and it just feels deflating and you want to give up because you don't feel like you're getting anywhere. And if you only could watch other people who were struggling, then that might give you a little kick up the backside to say, yeah, I'm not as bad as I thought I was. This person's just as bad as me. So I'm just using the shapes of the paint to dictate where things go. And if you put things in the wrong place, it really doesn't matter. You've got two choices with this technique. You can either draw in the ink lines where you think they should be, or just go with where the paint has ended up. And because the paint bleeds and goes all over the place, you might end up with a building that is all the way into the middle of the page or on the completely wrong side. You might not have room to fit all the stairs in, or the building in the background might have ended up mostly green because all the colours bled into the yellow. It really doesn't matter when you're doing this technique. You can just go with it and just try and enjoy the rhythm of the paint and where it's ended up. I've done maybe 2 or 3 other wet in wet sketches like this where I've put the paint down first and then drawn over the top of it. And ironically, despite the fact that I really haven't got a clue what I'm doing, these do tend to be much more popular than the videos I do where I feel like I actually know what I'm doing. So there's a mystery for you. Maybe it's a bit like when you're out driving and there's been a crash on the other side of the road and you just can't look away. It's just human instinct to want to watch a disaster unfold. But this is no disaster. It does look approximately like the scene in the photo, and I even managed to draw a reasonably decent staircase, which is unusual for me. And I really like how the quinacridone and the blue have bled and merged under the staircase. It's almost like a stormy sky, but in concrete. It's a very unusual effect and I love it. So to get back to the drawing, I have done the railings in front of the window, and always my way of drawing, because it's solid lines, I draw the foreground items first and then the things behind it after that. So the railings are in front of the window, so you draw the railings first and then the big window with the shutters behind it. And I'm trying not to spend too much time adding lots and lots of detail, just little dashes, because I didn't want this sketch to go on for hours. Often I do get carried away and end up with sketches that are far too long to be able to show in real time, so I've tried to keep this one fairly basic in terms of the level of detail that I'm putting in. And in fact, I didn't even bother to draw the writing on the sign. I just decided to leave this sketch as the general outlines of the scene, because I really just wanted to try this as another watercolour experiment. And I think you do have to repeat things and practice things over and over again to even decide whether this is the right method for you. And I'm not totally sure if it is the thing for me, but if you try it once and then go, well, no, that's not for me, it doesn't really tell you much. It just says that you've only tried once. I find that I have to try things quite a number of times, and then it'll either start to click or I'll decide that it's not for me. And I suppose the thing with watercolour is that I did try it a few times at the beginning, then decided I wasn't really very good at it, but I don't think that's the case. It can't be. It's just a case that I haven't practiced enough and I don't know enough about how watercolour actually works. And yet, despite that, you can still produce things like this that look fairly good, and they're not disastrous by any means. So I'm not too far away from where I wanted to be with this sketch. I was just paused for a moment just to check if there was any other things I wanted to add in. And I added in the left edge of that doorway. And then there's a few bits and pieces that you can just make out. There's a little sign, a number 5 for the gallery entrance. And then there's some crisscrossed wooden slats just below that. So I've just drawing in a few of those, squeezing them in. And if you are trying this yourself, you can add in as much or as little detail as you like. You could continue on and draw the writing on the signpost or in the building, the yellow building behind it, right up at the top. There's sort of a dirtiness to it. You could maybe add in some more stuff like this and you can go wild with it. I just decided to keep it clean and as vibrant as I could. This is in effect drawing and painting like you're 5 years old again. That's what I love about sketching and playing with paint. It does just take you back to being a kid again. And that's always the spirit that I try to approach my sketches with. Just trying really hard not to overanalyze and think too much about the end result, just to try and enjoy the activity, which I know is very difficult, but that's really the way that I try to approach this because I feel I will enjoy it a lot more. So I was just adding in a few little curled marks on the iron work just to try and make it look a bit more three-dimensional. And by this stage I'm just fiddling because I'm always like that. I just keep adding more and more detail. And this is in a sketch where I was saying I wasn't adding much detail, but there's always the temptation just to keep adding stuff. And I could have added another layer of paint over the top. Perhaps you could make the gallery sign stand out more from the background if you painted it over again with another layer of the turquoise green, but I quite like the colours bleeding through, so I just left it as that. And I did deliberately make the railing at the top very wonky because that's just the type of drawing that I like to do. And then beyond the yellow building, you can just catch sight of the edge of the buildings behind, and so I added in a couple of windows and just some simple lines there. And this is by no means a perfect sketch, but I did enjoy it, and I feel like it's a good first step as I really try now to take my watercolour sketches to the next level. So no video next week if you're watching this at the time the video goes out, but I will be back the following week, and hopefully over the next few weeks as I go on this watercolour journey I will start to see some real improvements that I can share with you and offer some encouragement for your own watercolour sketching experiments. And if you'd like to see more sketching inspiration like this, you can click on this video right here, and I will see you in the next one.